Well, of course. I mean, and it's still it's still based on the same principles of what I think comedy is about. I think there's a big difference between comedy and sense of humour.
What is comedy? I'm aware that trying to philosophize something like comedy that is intended as joyful and lighthearted can be a bit of a bummer, but don't think of this as an examination of comedy in the way you usually look at it, but as a medium that most of today's philosophers have chosen to convey their ideas through. I'm not the first person to examine comedy through a philosophical lens, though. This art form has been around since the beginning of history, and I'm pretty sure that it preceded that. Academics, essayists, and great philosophers from every era have sit down to contemplate and write about this extremely influential form of art. That is because true thinkers do not merely look at the lightness of comedy, but to the change in perspectives that laughter can bring about. It's safe to say that comedy emerged hand in hand with existential contemplation, social and political commentary, and moral criticism. In fact, comedy has been a haven for these activities to the point that they have come to define the art, not simply be a part of it. In this lies my whole point. What proves my point about how comedy is so intertwined with philosophy is the fact that it emerged in its first organized and documented form in ancient Greece alongside Greek philosophy, or more like a variant of it, and the first people to take it upon themselves to contemplate the nature and value of comedy were the ancient Greek philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle. At that time, the dominant theory was the superiority theory, which insisted that we viewed as comic whatever we felt was inferior to us, as long as, of course, sympathy was somehow excluded from the equation. Comedy itself was seen as a means of extracting any feelings of sympathy or distress from otherwise tragic situations. And although the superiority theory has become outdated or more accurately incomprehensive, this fact remains true. As a matter of fact, the fine line between comedy and tragedy is empathy, and as soon as you wipe out that line, what might have otherwise brought you to tears ends up cracking you up with laughter. As comedy developed, the philosophy of comedy grew with it, and philosophers from all fields had their contributions in that area, seeing as how comedy exists in adjacency with almost every human sphere, from politics to psychology. Despite the differences between those philosophers and every other field, when it came to comedy, each of Plato, Kant, Hobbes, Descartes, and many others were in consensus on the incongruity theory. They all believed that comedy manifests in any display of the disparity between what is and what should be. That's what gave comedy its philosophical weight, because by mocking how things are, comedians get to show us, whether directly or indirectly, how they think things should be. But still, this definition of comedy came as comedy had reached a certain level of maturity. As it grows even more mature, to the point where it stands today, I think that definition has become like its precursor, unable to capture the broader essence of comedy. In recent years, comedy has no longer become one of the platforms for conveying original philosophical ideas. It's safe to say that in the past few years, original philosophies have deserted the serious forms of writing and the tragic storylines where they used to reside in previous centuries and have today become exclusive to comedy. Today, one can only find new and original perspectives on life in the work of stand-up comedians like Dave Chappelle, George Carlin, Louis C.K., Jim Jeffries, among many others, in sitcoms like Seinfeld or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, or in cartoons like Rick and Morty or Futurama, again, among many other great works that this grand genre has produced. It's not the first time that great philosophical work has come in the form of comedy. In every era, there were philosophers who chose to joke and provoke. Cratinus and Aristophanes of the Old Comedy era were among the staunchest critics of 5th century BC Athens. In 14th century England, there was Geoffrey Chaucer. 15th century France had François Villon. The 16th century Netherlands had Erasmus. 17th century France had Molière. 18th century Russia had Nikolai Gogol. Charles Dickens and the great Oscar Wilde poked 19th century Britain right in the butt. And George Orwell came in the early 20th century to leave us with an understanding of tyranny that lives on to this day, and whose symbols rise up whenever our present-day leaders step out of line. All of these left their marks when and where they lived, and some of them even transcended their time and place and are present today in the conscience of people from all over the world. However, as comedy has come to take its position today as the almost exclusive medium for modern-day philosophers, I think it's time for a new definition for comedy, and more than any other time, a distinction between comedy and humor, so as not to have the only philosophical products of our day faded out in a cluster of juvenile wisecracks that we might very much enjoy, but have got to distinguish from this higher art form called comedy. The old definitions would place shows like Seinfeld or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia in the same category with Friends or The Big Bang Theory, and would put Dave Chappelle, Louis, Carlin, and Ricky Gervais side by side with Mitch Hedberg or Stephen Wright, when the only thing they all have in common is the reaction that they provoke, which is laughter, and not anything in the substance that they provide. Of course, comedy needs jokes to be called comedy, but a comedian needs much more than jokes to deserve being called a comedian. As much as I enjoy Jimmy Carr's one-liners and Stephen Wright's anecdotes, I can only call them master jokers, but would not give them any credit as comedians. The same applies to Friends and How I Met Your Mother, for example. Such work deserves the humor label, but does not at all deserve to be labeled as comedy. The material provided in each of these shows and by each of the jokers I just mentioned is similar to the work that was produced in an ancient period that is seen as one in which the art of comedy was in disastrous decline. While a show like Louis resembles Geoffrey Chaucer's embrace of the minor fragments of human existence, both beautiful and ugly, or Moliere's vivid depiction of personal tragedy, romantic sitcoms like Friends are similar in nature to the work produced in the Middle and New Comedy eras of ancient Greece, two eras that represent the virtual death of the art of comedy. They also resemble the early Roman comedy, which was influenced by the Middle and New Comedy eras, with the addition to it of a deeply romantic touch. If we are to search for the ancient ancestors of Friends, for example, we would find them in these eras of lenient juvenile farce that marked the decline of the art of comedy, and not in the grandeur of the old comedy era. So why is it that shows like Friends or How I Met Your Mother not qualify for the comedy title, in my opinion? Simply because they lack the sharp, contemplative, or at least provocative nature of comedy. They and many similar shows came out in a certain time and place, within the moral and social boundaries of their environments. But instead of pushing these boundaries or even demolishing them, they were content to playfully hop around within their confinements. Think of it in this way. A show like Friends has a central element, which is the incremental improvement of each of its main characters throughout the show's grand plot. The subplots in every episode very gradually feed into this improvement. The show ends by Monica and Chandler deciding to settle at a bigger house outside the city where they can raise their kids. Ross and Rachel finally get back together, and so on and so forth. The improvement that these characters undergo throughout the series is measured in direct proportionality with the degree by which they conform to the dominant moral standards imposed by society. There is not one attempt at breaking these boundaries, or at least stretching them, for example, like we see in Seinfeld, where until the very end of the show, our four main characters remain as the inconsiderate assholes that we had met in the first episode. Not to speak of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, whose characters are not only considered evil within the bounds of the mainstream values of the society they live in, but rather seem to live completely outside those boundaries. Actually, the way that Friends and later How I Met Your Mother and The Big Bang Theory copied many of the elements of Seinfeld, like the idea of the city gang, the door-to-door setting, the hangout spot, and so on, is similar to the way in which the comedians from the New Comedy era of ancient Greece copied those of the Old Comedy era by adopting their formats and joking styles, but again using them without disturbing any social or political boundaries. I'm not talking that a comedian has to be a philosophical mastermind who stuffs his jokes with layers of existential reflection and political and social scorn. When a person jokes, we get to see which parts of whatever event or idea they're joking about they choose to exaggerate and emphasize, and through that, sometimes even without their intention, We get to realize what their worldview is like. They knowingly or unknowingly offer us some lens through which we can see things. If that lens is as good as a tickle or a nitrous oxide pump, then that artist can only be named a joker, not a comedian. That is not meant condescendingly, but we need to give things their proper names. If, however, the lens they offer you causes a distortion to your worldview, or at least brings you to some degree of skepticism regarding your morals and values in life, only then can that artist be considered a comedian. To take it up another level, if that artist is capable of permanently installing their lens into your brain in a way that lets you view things that you encounter in your own life away from their material through that lens, then that artist is a comedy master. It is the work of such comedy masters that changes the ideas of generations and inspires new comedy masters. I'm done here, so like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you have an idea about what I just said, say it in the comments and start a conversation. That's what Ingenium is all about.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes